Hello everyone, it's time for the next segment of The Hobbit. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, it's patreon.com/bowtiewhisperguy. And not only will you get more of things like this, but you also can request your own customized recordings. But let's go ahead and get back to The Hobbit. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went off, poof, into the tower of blue glowing smoke, right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls, and curses, shrieking and shirking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves began roasting slowly alive. Together would not have compared with it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell through the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were all falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed on its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin. As he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage, he fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me, quick," said the voice, fierce and quiet. Before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot. At the end of the line, down more dark passages, with the yells of Goblin Hall growing fainter behind them, a pale light was leading them on. "Quicker, quicker," said the voice. "The torches will soon be relit." "Half a minute," said Dory, who was at the back next to Bilbo, and a decent fellow. He made the Hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best he could with tied hands, and then off they went at a run, with the clink-clink of their chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not long for a while did they stop, but by that time they must have been right down into the very heart of the mountain. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf, but just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with rage that made it gleam if goblins were about. Now it was a bright as blue flame for delight in killing the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatsoever cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater, and hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Orchrus, too, had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for a friend in a tight corner. "Are we all here?" he said, handing the sword back to Thorin with a bow. "Let's me see, that's one, that's Thorin. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Feely and Keely? Ah, here they are. 12, 13, and here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, well, it might be worse. Then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies, no food, and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go!" On they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far in the passages they had just come through. That sent them on faster than ever, and his poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to. They took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They made the paths themselves, and they were madly angry. so that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could even hear the flap of the goblin feet, many feet, which seemed only just around the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel where they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. Why did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. Why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggered along with the great sweat dripping down his nose in heat and terror. At this point Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned a sharp corner. "About turn!" he shouted. "Draw your sword, Thorin!" There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying around the corner in full cry, and found goblin cleaver and foe hammer shining in the cold, and the bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave a yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more and leaped back, knocking over those that were running after them. "Biter and Beater!" they shrieked, and soon they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back the way they had come. It was quite a long while before any of them dared to turn that corner. By that time the dwarves had gone along a long way into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they put out their torches, and they slipped on their soft shoes, and they chose their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and eyes. These ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, and hardly any more noise than bats. That is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard them coming, nor did they see them, but they were seen by the goblins, who ran up silently behind, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly Dory, now at the back again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a rock, and remembered nothing more. Chapter 4. Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as when he shut them. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone on the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours, till he touched the wall of the tunnel. But neither up nor down he could find anything, nothing at all. No sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside him it was high time for some meal or other, but that only made him more miserabler. He could not think of what to do, nor could he think of what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why it had been he had been left behind. The goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was, he had been lying quiet, out of sight, out of mind, in the dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it. That was something more. Then he felt for matches, and could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him, as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought out of the dark holes in that horrible place. Still, at that moment he felt very crushed. But in slapping all his pockets and feeling around for his matches, his hand came to the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger he had gotten from the trolls, and that he had quite forgotten. Not fortunately had the goblins noticed it, for as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade, too, he thought, and the goblins are not very near, yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars, of which so many songs had sung, and also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on the goblins that came upon them suddenly. Go back, he thought. No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only thing to do. On we go. So up he got, and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all of patter and of pitter. Now certainly Bilbo was in what we call a tight place, but you must remember it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, and after all, if their holes are nice cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of goblins, still, they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads are quite recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, as they have a fund of wisdom and wise saying that men mostly never heard of or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Bilbo Baggins' place all the same. The tunnels seemed to have no end. All he knew was that he was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist or turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and again, and he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or he could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On and on he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on and on until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to days beyond. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into the water. Ugh! It was icy cold. That pulled him up sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path, or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage, or the brink of a dark and subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, if he listened hard, drops, drip, drip, dripping from an unseen roof in the water below. But there was seen no other sound of any sort. So it is a pool, or a lake, or not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging blind eyes wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountain, fish whose fathers swam in goodness knows how many years ago and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there were other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and the caves of goblins had made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from the outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back to their beginnings, to ages before goblins, who only widened them and joined them up with passages, and their original owners are still about there in odd corners, slinking and nosing about. And I'm going to get to exactly what he discovers there, I think you may know, in the next installment. Are you ready for Riddles in the Dark? Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.